The air in Blackwood, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1911, had a crisp, melancholic bite. It carried the scent of wet leaves and the distant whistle of a coal train, a constant reminder of the town's industrious heart. For the Durant family, their stately brick home on Elm Street had always been a bastion of quiet tradition. Mr. Thomas Durant, a respected lawyer, and his wife Clara had raised two daughters there, Eleanor, 21, with a mind as sharp as her wit, and Beatrice, 19, a delicate soul with a love for literature and the piano. Their lives were a symphony of predictable, gentle rhythms until the music stopped. It began subtly, an off-key note in a perfect harmony. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday evening, a night like any other. The family was gathered in the parlor, the only sound the crackle of the fireplace and the rustle of newspapers. Without warning, Beatrice let out a sharp, guttural cry that seemed to tear from deep within her. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on a corner of the room where only shadows danced. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Eleanor, sitting across from her, watched in horrified silence as her sister's face twisted into an expression of abject terror, a mask of pure, primal fear. "Beatrice, my dear, what is it?" Clara rushed to her side, her voice trembling. Thomas dropped his paper, his face a mask of concern. "What's wrong with her?" Beatrice didn't answer. She only moaned, a low, rasping sound, before her body went limp and she collapsed onto the velvet settee. She remained unconscious for several minutes, her breathing shallow and ragged. When she finally awoke, her eyes were hazy. She looked at her family with a strange, disconnected blankness, as if she had just returned from a long journey. I had a terrible dream," she whispered, her voice raspy. "A nightmare." But the nightmare, they would soon discover, was just beginning. The episodes became a nightly torment, a cruel ritual that played out in the dark hours. The first few times, they were always directed at Beatrice. Her screams would pierce the silence of the night, followed by a violent, thrashing panic. One night, she tore the lace curtains from her window, her slender fingers working with an unnatural strength, while her eyes, glazed and vacant, stared into the darkness of the garden below. On another, they found her in the attic, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself in a voice that was not her own, a jumble of words that held no discernible meaning. The local doctor, a kind but old-fashioned man named Dr. Miller, was baffled. He attributed her symptoms to female hysteria and prescribed a sedative that did nothing to quell the episodes. His diagnosis felt like a brush-off, a way to put a neat label on something profoundly terrifying. The family, desperate and isolated, felt the walls of their carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "It's a curse, Thomas," Clara whispered one morning, her face pale with sleepless nights. "Something evil has taken hold of her." Thomas, a man of logic and reason, scoffed at the idea, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. He saw the same thing Eleanor did, a daughter who was becoming a stranger, her personality eclipsed by something dark and malevolent. Eleanor, however, refused to believe in curses. She was a woman of the modern age, a keen observer. While her parents prayed and worried, she watched. She noticed things. The episodes never happened during the day, only at night. They were always triggered by something subtle, a sound, a flicker of a lamp, or perhaps nothing at all. But most peculiar was the way Beatrice's body would contort, as if trying to get away from an invisible force. It wasn't a random panic. There was a pattern to the thrashing. It seemed to be in response to something unseen. The terror reached a crescendo a week later when the curse leaped from Beatrice to Eleanor. They had been sitting in silence, reading by the dim light of a gas lamp. Suddenly, Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, a feeling of being watched. She looked up and saw Beatrice's eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on her. The younger sister's lips moved slowly, forming words that were not her own, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from far away. "You're next." A wave of uncontrollable convulsions seized Eleanor. Her mind screamed in protest, but her body was no longer her own. She thrashed and fought against an unseen weight, a crushing, invisible pressure. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw before falling into the void of unconsciousness was the look of utter, heartbroken terror on her mother's face. As she drifted back to awareness, she was lying in her bed, a heavy silence hanging over the room. The air was thick with tension and despair. Eleanor sat up, her body aching, her mind replaying the horror. She didn't believe in curses. She couldn't. But she was a rational woman, and what she was experiencing was defying all logic. She was now part of it, a victim. The episodes were not random, they were not hysteria, they were a reaction to something. And as Eleanor looked out her window at the still, dark town of Blackwood, a chilling thought crystallized in her mind. Something or someone was doing this to them. The curse was not supernatural, it was a calculated human act. The question was why, and who was behind it. And as she glanced at the reflection in the glass, she saw not just her own haunted face, but the terrified face of her sister, still lost in the throes of a nightmare that had become their waking reality. The true horror was just beginning. If you're ready to unravel the mystery with us, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of the horrifying curse of the Durant sisters who were possessed night after night. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations and frayed nerves. The family home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Eleanor and Beatrice were confined to their rooms, the fear of another nocturnal fit a constant, suffocating weight. Their parents, Thomas and Clara, were a portrait of despair, their faces etched with the sleepless nights and the gnawing anxiety that had replaced their gentle composure. The local whispers grew louder, fueled by Dr. Miller's vague diagnosis of a severe nervous affliction. It was a polite way of saying the Durant family was unraveling. But Eleanor was not unraveling. The episode that had gripped her had not broken her. It had sharpened her. The terror had been a catalyst, turning her from a victim into an investigator. She refused to accept her father's logic that the only path was to wait and see, or her mother's desperate prayers. She was certain of one thing. There was a pattern. A cruel, invisible hand was pulling their strings. She began a meticulous log. Each night, she would stay awake, a penlight and a small notebook in hand, her senses on high alert. She recorded the time of each fit, the initial sound or sight that preceded it, the specific movements of her sister's body. She noted the direction Beatrice's eyes would fixate upon, the subtle clenching of her jaw, the specific words she sometimes muttered. She noticed that the episodes, while seemingly random, always seemed to be at their most violent when the house was at its quietest, when the moon was at its fullest, casting long, stark shadows across the garden. The external silence seemed to amplify the internal terror. The family's isolation deepened. Friends and neighbors, once frequent callers, now kept a respectful distance, their pity mixed with morbid curiosity. The Durant family became a cautionary tale, a subject of hushed gossip. It was during this period of forced solitude that an old family friend, Mr. Abernathy, a retired professor of psychology from the nearby university, paid them a visit. A man of quiet intellect and keen observation, he was a refreshing change from Dr. Miller's antiquated notions. "I have read Dr. Miller's notes, Thomas, and I must confess, I find them lacking," Mr. Abernathy said, his gaze fixed on Eleanor as she sat silently in the corner of the parlor. "This is not hysteria. This is a deliberate, targeted stress response. The mind is a powerful thing, and it can be manipulated without the host even knowing." Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition. Manipulated. That was it. He wasn't talking about ghosts or curses, but about a calculated human act. She took a breath and spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. "They feel deliberate, sir, as if we are being watched, as if someone is studying us." Mr. Abernathy's expression softened. "My dear, the feeling of being observed is a very real component of certain psychological traumas. It is a sign of a mind on edge. However, in this case, it might not be a feeling at all." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "A theory, if you'll entertain it. Let us assume for a moment that what you are experiencing is not a curse, but a form of psychological assault. A very modern, very cruel one. A person could, with the right knowledge of the human nervous system, manipulate others from afar. A specific sound, a flickering light at a specific frequency, a scent. These can trigger an involuntary physical response in a susceptible person." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. He was describing exactly what she had been feeling. A chill ran down her spine, but it was not from fear. It was from a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't an invisible enemy. It was a human one. That night, she decided to act on her suspicions. Armed with a lantern, she slipped out of the house into the moonlit garden. The air was colder, the silence deeper. The long, skeletal shadows of the trees seemed to reach out and grab at her. She walked slowly, methodically, inspecting the perimeter of the property. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now a fuel, a cold fire in her gut. She examined the bushes, the fences, the ground near the house. And there, near the thick ivy that covered the parlor window, she found it. A small scuff mark in the soft, damp soil. It was not a random mark, it was the imprint of a man's shoe. And next to it, partially buried in the leaves, was the butt of a cigar, a brand her father didn't smoke. The scuff mark was recent. The evidence was undeniable. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. A silent watcher, a human predator waiting in the darkness. The discovery was a terrible confirmation, but also a source of grim determination. She was right. The curse was not a supernatural plague. It was a targeted campaign of terror. And now that she had proof, she knew she wasn't fighting a phantom. She was fighting a very real, very human monster. The thought was terrifying, but also, in a strange way, empowering. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was the one who was going to stop this. The discovery of the scuffed shoe print and the cigar butt became Eleanor's secret burden. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a chilling mix of terror and grim satisfaction. Her suspicion had been confirmed. The curse was a fabrication, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. But how could she convince her parents? Her father, a man of rational law, would demand more than a shoe print. Her mother was too consumed by prayer and fear to listen. They were trapped in the belief of a mysterious, unseen force, while the true enemy was a flesh and blood man lurking in the shadows. The attacks grew more brazen, more targeted. The nightly episodes were no longer random. They would occur during specific family moments. One evening, as Thomas and Clara were arguing about seeking a second opinion, Beatrice suddenly seized, her body trembling violently. Another night, after a visit from their kindly but skeptical neighbor, Eleanor herself felt the familiar dread wash over her, followed by a wave of nausea and the loss of muscular control. The attacks were a cruel puppet show, and someone was pulling the strings, tailoring the torment to maximize their suffering. Eleanor, now fully committed to her clandestine investigation, began her nightly vigil. She would sit in her darkened room, a blanket over her knees, her eyes fixed on the window overlooking the garden. The moon, a cold white orb in the sky, cast a pale glow, turning the familiar rose bushes and trees into grotesque, menacing figures. The nights were long, cold and silent, a test of her resolve. On the third night of her vigil, just as the church bell struck midnight, she saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the property, near the old, forgotten sentry box that had been there since the Civil War. It was a fleeting motion, a dark shape against the paler darkness of the trees. It was a man. He moved with a practiced stillness, a silent predator. He stood there for a few moments, a black silhouette, his gaze fixed on their house. Then he raised something small and metallic to his face, and a soft, low hum, barely perceptible, drifted on the wind. It was in that moment that Eleanor understood. The curse was a reaction to this sound, this hum, this unseen force. It was a calculated, deliberate act of torment. She watched, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs as the shadow lingered, watching. He was not a phantom. He was a person with a specific device, a specific motive. The shadow moved, and Eleanor's resolve hardened. She had to get closer, to see who he was. She crept down the stairs, her feet silent on the cold wood, the floorboards groaning in protest. She slipped out the back door, the autumn air a sudden shock against her skin. She moved through the garden, a small, courageous figure in the vast, moonlit space, her eyes fixed on the sentry box. She kept to the shadows of the hedges, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The scent of wet earth and dying leaves filled the air. As she drew closer, the figure was gone. The sentry box was a dark, silent shape, a blank slate in the garden. She felt a wave of crushing disappointment, but also a renewed determination. She had seen him. She wasn't crazy. But the evidence was gone, leaving her with nothing but a frantic memory. She returned to the house, shaken but not defeated. The next morning at breakfast, she tried to tell her father. Her voice was strained, her words tumbling out in a desperate flood. "Father, I saw him. In the garden. A man, with some kind of device. He's doing this to us." Thomas looked at her, his expression a mix of weary pity and exasperation. "Eleanor, my dear, you are exhausted. You've been frightening yourself with these late-night vigils. There is no man. The stress is affecting you, just as it's affecting your sister. Please, for your own sake, you must stop." Her mother placed a trembling hand on her arm. "Eleanor, my darling, we must have faith. We must pray, not hunt for ghosts." Eleanor's frustration was a bitter taste in her mouth. She was alone in this. The very people she was trying to protect were blind to the truth. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a chilling realization that if she was going to stop this, she would have to do it by herself. The weight of her secret knowledge was a heavy burden, a crushing responsibility. But with that burden came a ferocious resolve. She was no longer just the older sister. She was a woman on a mission, hunting a very human demon in the heart of Blackwood, Pennsylvania. The dismissal from her parents hardened Eleanor's resolve. If they would not believe her, she would find the proof they couldn't deny. The old sentry box became her prime suspect. It stood on the far edge of their property, a relic of a time long past, overgrown with ivy and hidden from the main house. It was the perfect vantage point for a predator. That night, she waited until the house was swallowed by a deep, heavy silence. The old clock on the mantelpiece chimed 2 in the morning. She dressed in dark clothes, a pair of her father's old boots, and armed herself with a thick flashlight. She moved through the house like a ghost, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The air was colder than before, the scent of a coming rain heavy on the wind. She slipped out the kitchen door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The darkness was absolute. She moved through the garden, the flashlight beam a narrow tunnel of light, illuminating the wet leaves and the gnarled roots of the old oak tree. The feeling of being watched was no longer a distant dread. It was a physical presence, a cold stare on her back. The sentry box loomed before her, a squat, dark silhouette. The wood was rotten, the paint peeling. She pushed open the door, which gave way with a mournful creak. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and stale cigars. She shone her light around the small space. It was not a storage shed. It was an observation post. In one corner, There was a makeshift wooden stool. A pair of binoculars lay on the seat. On the ground beside it, a handful of cigar butts, the same brand she had found near the parlor window. Her flashlight beam caught something else, a meticulously carved hole in the wall, perfectly aligned to offer a clear view of the Durant family parlor. The sheer, calculated malice of it made her stomach churn. Her eyes fell on a small, crude wooden box, covered in wires and what looked like a large horn, like that of an old-fashioned gramophone. The wires were connected to a small metal crank. It was a crude device, but one designed for a specific purpose. It was not a mystical artifact. It was a weapon. The humming sound she had heard, a directed, resonant frequency. It was the source of their torment. Her heart pounded with a terrifying mix of triumph and dread. She had found it, the proof, the physical evidence of their nightmare. But as she knelt to examine the device, her flashlight beam caught a flash of metal on the ground. It was a small, silver pin, intricately carved with the initials J.H. The initials were a cold, hard clue, a breadcrumb left behind by their tormentor. The ground was soft inside the box. She found other signs of frequent visits. A depression in the dirt where someone had sat for hours, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in paper, the scuffed heel marks from the boots of the silent watcher. This was no fleeting act of vengeance. It was a months-long campaign of psychological terror. A wave of cold rage washed over her. This was not a madman on a whim. This was a patient, calculating, and vicious enemy. She stood, her hand gripping the small metal pin, and felt a rush of power. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer just a girl who had a strange fit. She was the one who had uncovered the truth. She had the evidence she needed. She rushed back to the house, the small pin clutched in her hand. The rain started to fall, a cold, mournful drizzle. The truth was out there, but she had only half of it. The J.H. pin was the key. She had to find out who those initials belonged to. Her father had handled hundreds of cases. She would have to go through them all to find the one person with a motive strong enough to dedicate their life to a cruel, psychological vendetta. As she entered the house, the silence was still there, but it no longer felt like a void. It was filled with the promise of a coming storm. The Durant family's world had been shattered by an invisible enemy, and now Eleanor was holding the very thing that would expose him. The hunt was on, and she was no longer the prey. The next morning, the exhaustion of the sleepless night was a heavy blanket over Eleanor. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her body ached, but a cold, hard resolve had replaced her fatigue. Armed with her physical proof, she went to her father's study. The room was a sanctuary of his intellectual life, filled with the scent of old leather, dust, and pipe tobacco. Thomas Durant, a man of orderly habits and a life governed by the solid bedrock of reason and legal precedent, was a difficult man to convince of a conspiracy that sounded like something from a penny dreadful. But Eleanor had a piece of evidence he could not ignore. She placed the small silver pin with its intricately carved initials, J.H., on the corner of his large oak desk. Then, in a steady voice that belied the frantic state of her inner world, she recounted her nightly vigil. She spoke of the sentry box, the crude, rudimentary device inside, and the precisely carved spy hole that had offered their tormentor a clear view of their parlor, their most vulnerable moments laid bare for a hidden observer. Her voice was firm, a clear contrast to her mother's fearful whispers and her sister's broken silence. Thomas listened, his face a mask of weary skepticism. He picked up the pin, turning it over in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Eleanor, this is... well, it's a theory. A fascinating one, I will give you that, but a theory nonetheless. The device could be anything. The pin could have belonged to anyone. It is not conclusive. Father, the device was pointed at our parlor. It was designed to cause the fits, and someone has been watching us from that sentry box for weeks. The pin is not just a trinket, it is a clue." A direct link to the person who did this. You must know who these initials belong to, she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He looked at his determined daughter, a glimmer of the respect he had for her shining through his fatigue. J.H. I have had hundreds of clients with those initials. It's too vague. It is a needle in a haystack, Eleanor. We cannot accuse a man without irrefutable evidence. Not all of them would have a reason to want to destroy our family, Eleanor countered, her voice firm. This is not a random act of madness. It is a revenge plot. Think, Father. A client who felt wronged, someone who lost a case and blamed you for it. A person whose life was ruined by one of your legal victories. A man consumed by a burning hatred so powerful it has manifested into this cruel, physical weapon. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, a distant look on his face. He began to list off the old cases, the ones that had been particularly difficult, the ones that had left a bad taste in his mouth. The names came in a slow, halting stream, each one a memory of a bitter dispute over land, money, or reputation. Then he stopped. His eyes widened, a dawning horror on his face, the color draining from his cheeks. John Hayes, he whispered, the name hanging in the silent room like a curse. The Blackwood land dispute of 1909. The case of the Blackwood Commons. Hayes owned the land, a prime plot for the new railroad, but I argued the case for the town council. Hayes was a ruthless man, but he had no legal claim. The court ruled against him, and he lost everything. His entire fortune was tied up in that land. He was financially ruined. He swore he would make me pay. Said I wouldn't just lose my money, I'd lose my family too. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, a bitter taste of grim satisfaction. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a horrifying finality. The motive, the malice, the initials. It all pointed to one man, John Hayes. He wasn't a spirit or a ghost. He was a very real, very bitter man, living on the margins of society, consumed by a hatred so powerful it had manifested into a physical weapon of psychological torment. Just then, Clara entered the study, her face etched with worry. "Who are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. When Thomas explained, her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. The terror of a human enemy, a tangible threat that was far more frightening than any spectral one. "We must go to the police," she said, her voice shaking. But Thomas shook his head. "The police will laugh, my dear. A man with a crank box and a theory of sound waves. In 1911 they'll think we've all gone mad. And we don't know for sure it's him. We have a name and a pin. We need more." Eleanor knew he was right. They needed proof that would stand up in a court of law. They needed a confession. The thought was terrifying, a dangerous game of cat and mouse. But the alternative, living with this torment for the rest of their lives, was worse. She looked at her father and saw a flicker of the same grim resolve that was burning in her. The two of them, a man of logic and a woman of observation, had found common ground in their shared determination. "We will get him," Eleanor said, her voice low and steady. "We will make him confess." The family formed a plan, a risky, dangerous but necessary plan. They would set a trap. The next evening they would create a diversion. They would feign a new terrifying crisis, a loud, emotional scene that would draw out the culprit. They would make him believe he had succeeded in his mission. And when he was close enough, when his guard was down, they would make their move. The hunt was no longer a solitary one. Eleanor was no longer alone. The family was united not by fear, but by a shared purpose. To bring a human monster to justice and to end the horrifying curse once and for all. The night was a cold, starless canvas, a fitting backdrop for the morbid drama about to unfold. The wind howled, a mournful, rattling sound that shook the windows of the Durant home, providing a natural soundtrack for the orchestrated chaos. The family was a silent tableau, each member holding their breath, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The plan, a dangerous gambit to lure their tormentor into the open, was in motion. In the parlor, the gas lamps were burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The family began to stage their scene. Thomas and Clara, drawing on the raw emotion of their recent ordeal, engaged in a loud, frantic argument, their voices feigning a genuine breakdown. Clara's sobs were raw and convincing, her hands covering her face as if to hide her shame. Beatrice, pale and shaken, began to hyperventilate, her body trembling with a feigned panic that was almost too realistic. It was a cruel performance, a reenactment of their most vulnerable moments, but it was a necessary cruelty, a calculated risk to end their living nightmare. Eleanor watched from the window, her gaze fixed on the dark shape of the sentry box at the edge of the property. The suspense was a physical weight on her chest, a suffocating presence that was far more terrifying than any ghost. They were bait, and they were banking on a man consumed by his own revenge to take it. She held a small rudimentary recording device her father had procured from a colleague, a wax cylinder ready to capture the sound of their tormentor's voice. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The wind continued its wail, and the silence in between the gusts was filled with the frantic pounding of Eleanor's heart. Just as a flicker of doubt began to creep into her mind, she saw it. A faint, glowing red light, a brief flash from the sentry box, a signal of some kind, and then it vanished. Her heart leaped. He was there. He was watching. He was activating the device. A low, insidious hum, a sound so subtle it was barely audible over the wind, began to vibrate through the air. The sisters' feigned panic turned into a very real one, their nervous systems reacting to the resonant frequency. Their bodies began to twitch and convulse, a terrifying echo of the real episodes that had haunted them for weeks. The plan was working. He was close. "He's here," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with a mix of fear and triumph. Thomas nodded, his face grim and resolute. He gave the signal, a soft cough, and the family's performance reached its crescendo. Thomas began to smash a small ceramic vase against the fireplace, the sound of the shattering pottery, a perfect imitation of a family's collapse. Clara shrieked, her voice a piercing, desperate cry. Beatrice let out a gut-wrenching wail. The house was a symphony of chaos, a perfect imitation of a family's complete surrender to madness. The sound of footsteps crunched on the wet leaves outside, coming closer, a steady, deliberate rhythm. Eleanor's eyes were glued to the back door. The doorknob turned slowly, and a shadow detached itself from the surrounding darkness. It was a tall, gaunt man, his face a grim mask of satisfaction and vengeful glee. It was John Hayes. He stepped inside, his eyes gleaming with a terrible, malevolent light. He looked at the scene of the Durant family in what appeared to be utter mental and physical disarray, and a small, terrible smile spread across his lips. "It works," he whispered, a triumphant note in his voice. "I told you, Durant. I told you I would make you pay. You took everything from me. My land, my fortune, my honor. Now you have nothing. Your family, they're just empty vessels, trembling with the fear you gave them." His voice was a cold, chilling testament to a man who had been broken and rebuilt by his own hatred. As he spoke, Eleanor slowly raised the recording device, her hands trembling. "It wasn't a curse, was it?" she asked, her voice steady. "It was you. The sound from the box. You've been manipulating us. Like puppets on a string." Hayes laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Hysteria, they called it. A woman's malady, a nervous condition. I gave them a real one, a perfect symphony of terror, a masterpiece of human torment." He gestured to the struggling sisters, a proud gleam in his eyes. "I took a simple frequency, a resonant vibration, and I found the one that would make the Durant girls dance. I studied you. I watched you. I learned your weaknesses, and I used them against you." He was a maniac, but his madness was chillingly rational. He explained the mechanism, the hours of experimentation, the triumph he felt each time a scream tore from their throats. He was confessing to a calculated and terrible act, a crime against their minds. At that moment, the lights in the house flashed on. Thomas and Clara stood, their faces no longer contorted in fear, but in grim determination. Thomas held a shotgun, pointed directly at Hayes. "The only thing you've taken from us, Hayes, is our peace," Thomas said, his voice a low growl of pure, concentrated fury. "And now you will pay for it." Hayes's face went from triumph to a look of utter, heartbroken shock. He had been so consumed by his own madness that he had walked directly into their trap. He had confessed to everything, and it was all on the wax cylinder. He was a monster, but he was a captured one. The curse was over. The air in the parlor, once filled with the phantom terror of a vengeful man, was now thick with the scent of gun smoke and the lingering tension of a battle won. John Hayes, his face a mask of bitter disbelief, was disarmed and bound. The police, finally summoned by a frightened Clara, arrived to find the man they had once known as a successful landowner, now a pathetic shell of himself, confessing to a crime they could barely comprehend. They had to be shown the crude device from the sentry box and the wax cylinder with his chilling confession before they could believe the unbelievable. They dismissed it as a nervous breakdown, a small-town man's descent into madness. They would have laughed at the idea of a sound curse, but the evidence was undeniable. The crude device found in the sentry box, the footprints, the recorded confession on the wax cylinder. It was all there. Hayes was taken away, his quiet descent into madness now a public spectacle, a cautionary tale for all who sought revenge. For the Durant family, the arrest of Hayes was a moment of profound, unsettling silence. The terror was gone, but the echo of it remained, a phantom limb of fear that still throbbed with a life of its own. The constant fear of the nightly fits had been replaced by the quiet, gnawing weight of trauma. The family's world had been shattered, and now they had to find a way to pick up the pieces, a task that seemed far more daunting than fighting a phantom. The town, once filled with gossip and pity, now looked on the Durants with a new, uneasy respect. They were survivors of a very strange and terrible event. But for Eleanor, the feeling of victory was short-lived. The episode stopped, but the memory of them, the deep-seated terror, lingered. Beatrice especially struggled. The knowledge that a man, a human being, had taken such pleasure in their suffering was almost more difficult to bear than the terror itself. "He used us, Eleanor," Beatrice said one afternoon, her voice hollow. "He made us his little dolls, and he pulled the strings. It wasn't a curse. It was a man's hatred. That's so much worse." Eleanor understood. A ghost or a spirit could be fought with faith. A human being with a motive was something far more terrifying. This was a psychological wound that would not heal with a simple arrest. The family, once a tight-knit unit, was now a group of individuals haunted by the same terrible secret. The bond between the sisters, once unbreakable, was now strained, the shared trauma having warped their perception of each other. One evening, Eleanor, unable to sleep, was in her father's study, going over the legal documents of the Hayes case. She was looking for an explanation, for a deeper understanding of the hatred that had driven a man to such lengths. She found an old photograph, tucked inside a folder. It was a picture of Hayes, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another man, a man she knew, Dr. Miller, the kind, old-fashioned doctor who had so readily diagnosed their hysteria. He was standing arm in arm with Hayes, a smile on his face, in a photo taken years ago at a town fair. Her blood ran cold. The coincidence was too great. She dug deeper. She found an old land survey, a document from the Hayes case. It was dated a year before the legal proceedings. The survey had been conducted by a firm hired by the town council, and the lead surveyor's name was listed at the bottom. Dr. Miller's brother. The same brother who had also mysteriously lost his life savings in the same case. The connections were not coincidental. They were a roadmap to a deeper conspiracy. A chilling thought crystallized in her mind. Dr. Miller's diagnosis hadn't been an act of ignorance. It had been an act of complicity. He had kept them from seeking a real diagnosis, a real solution. He had steered the family away from the truth, giving Hayes the time and opportunity to continue his cruel game. He wasn't just a bystander, he was an accomplice. The curse, Eleanor realized, was never about one man. It was about a network of bitterness and revenge, a spiderweb woven by two men who felt wronged by the world. The true horror wasn't in the fits themselves, but in the betrayal. In the knowledge that the very people they had trusted, the ones who had promised to help them, were the ones who had been pushing them further into the darkness all along. The true curse was the venom of human malice. Thank you for watching this gripping chapter of the story. If you're ready to unravel the mystery with us, make sure to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion of the horrifying curse of the Durant sisters who were possessed night after night. The news of John Hayes' arrest shattered the somber quiet of Blackwood like a stone thrown through a stained glass window. The whispers that had long haunted the Durant family home were replaced by the cacophony of reporters from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, their flashes illuminating the silent brick facade of the house. The curse of the Durant sisters was no longer a subject of local gossip and superstitious dread. It was a front-page sensation, a macabre tale of human malice and psychological cruelty. The town, once so quick to dismiss the Durants as victims of a strange, internal affliction, now looked upon them with a complex mix of pity, awe, and an unsettling, morbid curiosity. Their once respected home had become a monument to a terrible crime, a museum of suffering. Thomas Durant, a man whose life had been built on the foundations of logic and order, found himself thrust into the chaotic center of a media circus. He stood on his own porch, his back ramrod straight, his hands gripping the lapels of his coat as if for support. His voice, once a steady, reassuring presence, was strained and weary as he recounted the story of their ordeal, carefully choosing his words to convey the horror of what had transpired without betraying the deeper, more personal wounds. He was no longer just Thomas Durant, the respected lawyer. He was a survivor, a public figure of a private tragedy. Clara, a woman of gentle constitution, had retreated into herself. Her hands, once busy with embroidery and gardening, now fluttered restlessly, seeking solace in the small, repetitive rituals of her daily life. She would polish the silverware for hours, or rearrange the books on the shelves. Her movements an attempt to impose order on a mind that had been shattered by fear. She jumped at sudden sounds, her eyes darting to dark corners, seeing phantoms not of the supernatural kind, but of a very human, very real terror. The constant media presence, the prying questions, the curious stares of neighbors, it all served to reinforce the feeling that their nightmare was far from over. Beatrice, the younger and more fragile of the sisters, bore the deepest scars. The physical torment had ceased, but the psychological wounds were raw and festering. She had been the primary target, the one who had experienced the most violent fits, and the memory of her body betraying her, of her mind being a canvas for a madman's amusement, was a wound that refused to heal. She had retreated into the quiet confines of her room, spending her days with books that she rarely read, her eyes, once full of light, now shadowed by a deep and pervasive melancholy. Her pain was compounded by a growing resentment towards Eleanor. To Beatrice, Eleanor's logical, methodical investigation had turned her into a case study, a lab rat in a cold experiment. The memory of Eleanor's calm, detached observation during the fits was a bitter pill she could not swallow. One afternoon, as Eleanor brought a tea tray to her room, Beatrice turned on her, her voice thin and accusatory. "You weren't scared," Beatrice said, the words a direct blow to Eleanor's heart. "You were watching. You were taking notes. I was fighting for my life, a terrible, violent fight inside my own body, and you were just a spectator, an investigator taking notes on a new specimen." Eleanor's heart ached with the injustice of the accusation. She set the tray down carefully, her hands trembling. "I was trying to help you, Beatrice, to understand what was happening to us. We were alone, no one believed us. If I hadn't, we would still be living in that terror. We might have truly gone mad, not from a curse, but from the fear of the unknown." Beatrice shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It doesn't matter. You didn't feel it, not like I did. You didn't lose control of your own body, your own mind. You weren't possessed. You were just studying me, like I was a scientific curiosity." The word stung, a deep and painful wound in Eleanor's heart. She knew her sister was wrong, but she also knew the depth of her pain, the profound sense of violation she felt. The trauma had warped their perception of each other, creating a chasm between them that seemed impossible to cross. They were survivors, yes, but they were also victims, forever changed by the experience, their bond fractured by the very thing that had brought them together. The family began the slow, arduous process of picking up the pieces. The nightly terror was gone, but it had been replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety. They jumped at sudden sounds, their eyes darting to dark corners, the fear no longer external but a constant internal presence. The peace they had so desperately craved was still a distant dream, a fleeting memory of a time before the curse had taken hold. One afternoon, a letter arrived, its crisp, professional envelope sealed with wax. It was from Dr. Julian Miller. He offered his sincerest apologies for his misdiagnosis and hoped the family was well on the road to recovery. The letter was filled with carefully chosen words, a professional and distant gesture of sympathy. But when Eleanor read it, a cold chill went down her spine. The words were too perfect, too detached, too clean. They did not come from a man who had made a mistake, but from a man covering his tracks. She remembered the old photograph, the one with Hayes and Miller, and the chilling thought that had crossed her mind. The two men, linked by a shared past, a shared bitterness. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a conspiracy. Dr. Miller had actively hindered their recovery, his misdiagnosis, a deliberate act of sabotage. He wasn't an ignorant doctor, he was an accomplice. The rage Eleanor felt was a cold, pure thing. The curse was not a one-man show. And the true villain was still out there, hiding in plain sight, pulling the strings of a new kind of terror. The town of Blackwood, eager to move on from its dark chapter, gradually returned to its predictable rhythms. The newspaper headlines faded, the reporters left, and the curious stares of the neighbors became less frequent. Life on the surface returned to normal. The Durant family, however, remained trapped in the aftermath of their ordeal. The physical symptoms of the curse were gone, but the psychological wounds were raw and festering. The silence of their home, once a comfort, was now a constant reminder of the darkness that had filled it. Beatrice's withdrawal deepened. She was a ghost in her own home, a prisoner in her own mind. She would sit for hours by her window, a book in her hands, but her eyes, Eleanor noticed, were rarely on the page. She was lost in the vast internal landscape of her trauma, a silent world where the horrors of the past still lingered, haunting her every waking moment. The knowledge that a man, a human being, had taken such perverse joy in their suffering was a wound that refused to heal. Eleanor, armed with her grim suspicion, began a new, more dangerous investigation. She couldn't go to the police. They had their man, a simple, tidy explanation for the madness. They would dismiss her new theory as a symptom of her own nervous condition, a lingering side effect of the trauma. She was on her own again, in a much darker game. This time, her enemy was not a simple brute, but a calculating intellectual, a man who had used his position of trust to orchestrate their pain. She went to the public library, a quiet, dusty space with a wealth of local records. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and history. She spent hours poring over old newspapers from the Blackwood land dispute of 1909, the case that had ruined John Hayes. The articles, yellowed and brittle with age, detailed the legal proceedings, the key players, the shocking verdict that had cost Hayes his fortune and his sanity. It was here in the cold, silent stacks of the library that she found the missing piece of the puzzle. The articles detailed not only Hayes's loss, but also that of his primary backer, a close friend and investor who had also been financially ruined by the court's decision. The name, printed in a tiny font at the bottom of a list of investors, was one she now knew well: Dr. Julian Miller. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm against the silence of the library. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a partnership of vengeance. Hayes was the brute force, the madman with the cruel device. But Miller was the puppeteer, the mastermind who had manipulated the situation from the inside. He had used his position as a respected doctor to control the narrative, to ensure the Durants never looked for a human cause for their torment. He had gaslighted the entire family, turning their pain into a public spectacle of madness, all while secretly enabling the true horror. Eleanor felt a sickening wave of cold clarity. He had been so helpful, so kind, so full of pity. It had all been an act, a carefully crafted performance designed to lull them into a false sense of security. She thought of his gentle hands on her sister's arm, the sad, sympathetic look in his eyes, and a wave of pure revulsion washed over her. He had been a predator, hiding in plain sight, a wolf in a doctor's clothing. His weapon was not a crude device, but a sharp mind and a silver tongue. One evening, as the moon rose over Blackwood, a new terror began. It was not a violent fit, but something far more insidious, a psychological assault designed to unnerve and disorient them. A low, persistent knocking on the front door, just 3 taps, repeated every few minutes. When Thomas went to answer it, no one was there. The next night it happened again, followed by a faint, high-pitched scratching sound from the attic. Then, a few nights later, a single high-pitched scream echoing from the far corner of the garden. The sounds were not directed at the sisters, but at the entire family. They were a new kind of torment, a cruel and subtle assault designed to prove that the curse was not truly over. Eleanor's mind raced. Hayes was in prison, locked away behind stone walls. He couldn't be doing this. The new torment was a message, a clear, chilling message from the real mastermind. It was a sign that he was still watching, that he was still in control, a ghost in the machine of their family's torment. The realization was a devastating blow. They had put the physical monster behind bars, but the true architect of their terror was still free, still playing his cruel game. And he was getting bolder. Eleanor knew she had to act. She had to expose Dr. Miller, to prove to her family that the true danger was not a man with a grudge, but a man with a stethoscope and a motive. She would have to go to the heart of the matter, to confront the monster in his own lair, to face the true silent orchestrator of their madness. Eleanor knew she had to face him. The new torment, the phantom knocks and screams, were a clear sign that Dr. Miller was taunting them, proving that Hayes was just a pawn, and that the true game master was still at large. She decided to go to him, not as a victim, but as an investigator armed with proof. She would confront him, not with an accusation, but with a challenge, a psychological gambit of her own. She would make him confess to his crime. The next day she walked to Dr. Miller's office. The air was cool and crisp, but a nervous energy hummed in the air, a silent prelude to the storm that was about to break. His office was a place of quiet professionalism, filled with medical books and a sterile, clean scent. He greeted her with a warm, sympathetic smile, his expression a carefully crafted mask of a man who was concerned but professional. He was so good at his act that for a moment Eleanor felt a flicker of doubt. "Eleanor, my dear, what a pleasure to see you looking so well. I was just reading the papers. The whole town is in a state of shock over the Hayes affair. A terrible business." "It was a terrible business, Doctor," Eleanor said, her voice steady, a deliberate counterpoint to his feigned emotion. "But I don't think it was just Hayes." Miller's smile wavered, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Whatever do you mean?" "The land dispute of 1909, Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on his, not breaking contact. "The case that ruined John Hayes. It also ruined his primary investor, a man named Julian Miller, a man with a brother who was the surveyor. A man who, by a strange twist of fate, was our family doctor, the one who so quickly dismissed our fits as hysteria." Miller's face went pale. The mask of a professional melted away, revealing a man consumed by a cold, desperate fear. "Eleanor, I don't know what you're talking about. I lost my savings in that case, yes, but what does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," Eleanor said, her voice low and filled with a terrifying calm. "You didn't just lose money, Doctor. You lost your standing, your pride. You were humiliated, and you and Hayes made a pact. He would ruin my father's family, just as he had ruined you. He was the hammer, and you were the surgeon. You used your position to ensure our pain went on, didn't you? You diagnosed us with a psychological malady to keep us from looking for a real physical cause. You gave him the time he needed to break us, and now that he's in prison, you've picked up the game where he left off. The phantom knocks. The silent screams. You're proving to me that you're still in control." Miller's face twisted in a cold, venomous rage. He saw that she knew the truth. His carefully constructed facade shattered, and the true monster underneath was revealed. He leaned forward, his voice a low, chilling hiss. "He was a fool," Miller whispered, full of loathing. "A blunt instrument. I told him he should have been more subtle. It should have been a slow burn. A madness that no one could trace back to a man, only to a family's genetic failings." His eyes glittered with a dark, triumphant pride. "The human mind is a fragile thing, Eleanor. I studied it. I know its weaknesses. I gave you the terror you craved, the terror you wouldn't admit to. The curse was never about a demon. The true horror is in the mind, the terror that comes from a person knowing they are not in control. The most satisfying part of all was watching your family turn on one another, watching you lose your sanity one by one. You almost did, you know. But you were too clever. A shame." Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, a sudden and sickening realization of the depths of his depravity. He was not a madman driven by loss. He was a cold, calculating sociopath. He enjoyed their pain. The curse was not revenge. It was a cruel experiment in psychological torment. She took a deep breath, and from her pocket she pulled out a small, old-fashioned voice recorder, a newer model her father had acquired. It had been running the entire time, a silent witness to his horrifying confession. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "The shame is yours, Doctor. Because unlike your little friend Hayes, you just confessed to your crime while I was recording every single word." Miller's face went blank with a horrifying realization. The color drained from his face as he stared at the device in her hand. He lunged for her, his eyes wild with fury, but Eleanor was ready. She dodged him and ran to the door, pulling it open and shouting for help. People in the street, hearing her screams, rushed to her aid. Dr. Miller was taken away, his quiet, calculated life of manipulation and deceit finally brought to an end by his own arrogance and his fatal mistake of underestimating a young woman. The true curse, the Durant family realized, was not the strange fits or the terrifying whispers. It was the human capacity for cruelty. It was the cold, venomous malice of a man who would use his knowledge to destroy a family just to prove he could. The horrifying curse wasn't a supernatural affliction. It was the quiet, insidious evil that resided in the hearts of men, a darkness far more terrifying than any ghost or demon. The end of the story was not a happy one, but a chilling one. A reminder that the real monsters are not in the shadows, but among us, walking in the light.